What's happening, everybody? Welcome to the Paranormies Presents, our newest series. This is the Paranormies Presents Hollow Planets with a special guest, Mr. Jan Lamprecht. How are you doing?
Hi there. I'm doing fine, and thank you very much for having me on your show.
Oh, it's great to have you, and I'm really excited to get this started. Also with us today, good buddy there, Mr. Adam Haidt. How's it going, Adam?
Hey, how's it going?
Good.
It's going to be a pretty exciting new series.
Most definitely. A lot of people have been waiting for this. And also with us today from Haidt House, we have Larry Ridgeway. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, guys. Thank you for having me on.
Hey, thanks for coming on. And another one of our good friends of the show, Waylon. What's happening, buddy?
Nothing much. Nice to be on here, John.
Yeah, thanks for everybody getting together and doing this with us. Cool. Well, Jan, you are an author, and your book, Hollow Planets, a feasibility study of possible hollow worlds. I'm holding it in my hand. This is a pretty hefty tome. It's a good book. It's very. It's almost like a textbook on this subject, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's become something of a reference work on the hollow Earth, if I may say so.
Oh, I wouldn't doubt that. And also, you have two websites. You have Hollow Planets and what's the other? I'm sorry, History Revised. Is your second website?
I've got historyreviewed.com.
History Reviewed. I'm sorry.
I've got africancrisis.info.
And then those are pertaining to the issues down in South Africa, correct?
africancrisis.info is about Southern Africa. historyreviewed.com was when I started looking into history, and part of this also ties a little bit back perhaps to the hollow planets, is because part of hollow planets was science, but then part of it was also history. I went and started digging into certain things in history. And in fact, there are bits and pieces of things that I discovered and put in Hollow Planets that I still want to put on History Reviewed. It's about things that we either forgot about or were misrepresented. History Reviewed is really about misrepresented things in history, the lies that we've come to accept as the norm. And that is actually an enormous subject. But, Hollow Planets started as me being skeptical about many things in life. And that is the thing that flows through all three of my websites. I did a video for History Reviewed. One of my many videos that I did there was a video that I called Jew Shock When Whites Go Wonky. And I spoke about my wonky days. And a thing that I'm seeing in the world today that is common now, but which was not common when I was young, is what I call wonky people. And by wonky, what I mean is people who don't believe the normal narrative of life. You are born, you go to school. At school, they teach you science, they teach you history. You believe everything that you've been told. And when I was young, and I was growing up in what was then Rhodesia and is now Zimbabwe, as a youngster, I began to realize, because of our war and our political problems, and then later when we lost the war, I moved to South Africa. And that was in my late teens, early 20s, because I left and I came to South Africa when I was 17. And the results of what happened there changed me. And I immediately began to realize that the life that we had lived and the things that were being written about us in the mass media across the world, that what the world was hearing about us is not what actually happened. And so that was the beginning of what I would call my wonkiness, which in many respects has remained all my life. There are some things I've gone back on, but let me just explain. I immediately began to doubt everything that I heard in the mass media, because I began to realize that there is a difference between actual life and what they are putting out in the mass media and what people are believing. And I began to doubt current politics. I began to doubt history. I began to doubt science itself. When I was young and I was at school, they said to us, you know, I was in what was called the A class, and we were like, the children were separated, the white children were separated into the clever, the not so clever, and the backward, let's call it. And I was in the fastest class. And they said to us, you know, you guys in this class, you're in the top 5% of IQ. You should go to university. And so I should have gone to university, but I didn't for many reasons, including the fact that I was poor and my parents also, they totally struggled. Life went completely wrong for us. But even later, when I could have studied when I was older, I decided not to, because I'd learned to distrust everything in life. And I even distrusted science. And that is where hollow planets and all these other things come from. Now, back in the 80s and 90s, when I first had contact with Americans, because I first met Americans sort of face to face, if you will, on the internet, and even on the precursor of the internet. For a while here in South Africa, we had a thing called CompuServe, and I was on CompuServe for a year or two before the proper internet came out. And CompuServe was the first time in my life that I had direct communication with people outside of Africa. I could write messages, go on forums, and so forth. And back then, when I spoke to Americans, the Americans would just attack me. They'd be vicious, man. And they'd say, you nasty, horrible white people from South Africa. And I'd say to them, no, but you haven't heard everything that's happened here. And the Americans of those times believed 100%, almost all of them totally believed whatever the government said to you, whatever the newspapers said to you. But now in 2018, the world has changed a lot. And I think the big thing that made Americans go wonky was 9/11. Because after 9/11, lots of Americans began to start questioning all kinds of things. And nowadays, when I speak to people, and I speak to people from Europe, from Britain, I find that everybody is now what I would call wonky. You no longer just believe what you are told. And that, whereas when I was young, when I was living in the 80s and the 90s, when I started saying to people, you know, I question this, I don't trust that, I don't believe in that, people would say, no, man, you're a nutcase, man. You're a maniac. But now I find that that is the norm, actually. It's almost virtually the norm. And in some political circles that I've checked out on the white right, for example, you even get people starting to discuss concepts like the flat earth. The flat earth, something I regard as total rubbish, but it shows you the extent to which people have changed. And I regard it as a massive thing that's happened. It's like a worldwide phenomena, especially among white people in Western countries, where people no longer just believe everything they're told. Everyone is questioning virtually everything. And I think it's fabulous. I think an enormous change is taking place, and it's good. It's good.
I agree with that 100%. I wouldn't say that everybody has gone wonky in Britain. I mean, because there are still quite a few who are going along with the mainstream narrative. But I agree that it is that people are waking up. And in the United States, I would definitely say that 9/11 is one of the things that did wake up a lot of people to a lot of things. I think it kind of polarized a lot of people too. Like, you do have the people that completely believe the official narrative, and then you have the people that are woke on it. Then you have the truther movement who are they think they're woke, but they're not, but they're whatever. But yeah, it has helped a lot of people down into the rabbit holes that we all travel down here. And it is good to hear you say that you are not a flat Earth believer, as we are all sphere cucks, I believe. I don't believe anybody on the Paranormies is a flat earther. Are we, Adam? We never really asked this. Adam, are you a flat or sphere?
A flat Earth? I gotta say I'm probably a sphere cuck.
Yeah, we're more under the belief that
flat
the
Earth is a psyop.
It's dreidel shaped, right? And is that what it is?
Yeah.
Oh my god.
That's why it's spinning.
That's why it's spinning. Because the dreidel is always spinning. But that's for another episode. But yeah, that is definitely one of the things that got people into this wonky mindset. I know that 9/11 helped me along my path into this. I was always a skeptic. I grew up in a very religious household. And a lot of the things that were going on politically in the country and around the world, I would pay attention to, and it just didn't make any sense to me. And I did have a very hard time believing things in history, because it just didn't seem that it just seems to me that whatever the country that you were living in at the time when I grew up, Americans were the good guys at all times, and now we're the bad guys.
Yes.
It's weird how that happened. But I thought when I was a kid, I thought we were the good guys, and that now the history that I grew up on is incorrect, so it's manipulation all the way around.
Yeah, growing up in Rhodesia is pretty hardcore red pill.
Yeah, if that doesn't wake you up, I don't know what will. So it was this whole being wonky and being into the political mindset. Oh, real quick, you had mentioned that Americans, when you started mentioning South Africa, people started, with the you're an evil white from South Africa, and that even manifested in American media. I can remember, what was the movie? Was it Lethal Weapon 3, the one where they had the South African guy? The drug crew from South Africa, and they were here, and it was like there were the protests at the South African consulate, and they brought in the black guy, and they were, he was like, "Free South Africa, you dumb son of a bitch," and it was like because the whites were the bad guys, and they were promoting that in the movies here, that the whites were the evil ones. It's interesting. Now that I go back and think about that, the whites were always portrayed as the bad guys in the media here. Hey guys, I am so sorry about that. My internet just completely stopped. I wonder who could be behind that.
Yeah, they're working hard today.
What was the last thing?
Dreidel Earth.
What was the last thing you guys heard? Dreidel Earth? No.
Lenny, I can't. I think you were talking about politics and when you were young.
Oh, and Lethal Weapon.
Yes, Lethal Weapon.
Yeah.
So just tell me when we can start recording, then I'll start recording.
Yeah, go ahead. We'll just start recording again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go for it.
And I remember in the media here, the South Africans always being portrayed, the white South Africans always being portrayed as the bad guys. Even in the movies, there was that Lethal Weapon movie where they had the South African drug trade, money laundering deal somewhere in California, and and they brought the black guy to the South African consulate where they had a huge amount of protesters in front of because the Americans were protesting. Does anybody remember any of that? Does anybody remember any protests for South Africa here in the United States?
I think in the 80s. In the 80s, there were things around the world because it was all around the world, Britain especially.
Right, and they were trying to
Yeah,
give.
I wasn't even alive yet.
No, you were. Yeah, you're like 12. I know. But they were trying to give Africa back to the blacks, which is a whole. That's a topic for a whole other story. But yeah, so the South Africans were always portrayed. The white South Africans were always portrayed as the bad guy, and that's kind of how it is. And I wonder why that is, that the whites are always portrayed as the bad guy in the media. But this kind of set me along the way into my skepticism to everything. I am one of those people now that I don't believe anything that's written or produced by any sort of mainstream anything without researching it thoroughly myself. Especially if it's government produced. Like if the government says it's sunny outside, I have to go outside and look for myself just to make sure. But what exactly got you into the Hollow Earth itself? The Hollow Earth theory itself.
Okay. My interest in the paranormal began when I was a teenager, because then already I started questioning things. And my original interest that got me down this path that led to ever wilder things and culminated with hollow planets was when I began to think about life after death. That was the thing that I began to think about in my teens. And I used to visit the library a lot, and I saw books about life after death, and it was very curious to me. And so I began to read these things, and I read things on spiritualism and seances and contacting the dead. And that was what started making me question more and more. Then from there, the next obsession was UFOs. I began to read about people and flying saucers and visitors from outer space. That began to fascinate me, and it fascinated me for long. Then, as a part of that, as I was hunting through all these things, and I found conflicting information and conflicting data, I read about Atlantis. And even in Rhodesia, I would ask my mom, because those were the days before the internet. I eventually found catalogs of books and books that you couldn't get. And I would get these catalogs and I'd look through them and I'd see, oh, I want that book and that book. And then we'd order it from overseas, or we'd get it from a bookstore. So I began to gather those books together, and I was into everything that was psychic, paranormal, oh, you name it. There's nothing in the arena of the psychic and the paranormal that I didn't get interested in. And then the guy who became my sort of reference work was a guy called Lobsang Rampa. And I came across one of his books. And when I read Lobsang Rampa's books, because Lobsang Rampa claimed to be a Tibetan, and he was a Tibetan Lama, and he'd been highly trained in Lhasa, and he knew all sorts of things, and he started talking about his ability to astral travel. So
it might be good to point out to the listeners that Lobsang Rampa was actually a middle-aged Canadian man. Just to point it out.
I will tell you more about Lobsang Rampa, because later I started digging into him a lot, and I did some investigation into him. And you'll find one book that exists about Lobsang Rampa that was written by somebody else. There's a lady in Australia called Karen Mouton. It's spelled, let me type her name here for you. And she still exists on Facebook. You can find her, Karen Mouton. And I began a mailing list in the 1990s. When the internet finally arrived, I began a mailing list, and I started gathering some people together, and Karen Mouton was one of them. And we talked about hollow planets, and we talked about Lobsang Rampa as well. Now, Karen Mouton went on to write a book about Lobsang Rampa. She went and investigated him, and she wrote let's call it a favorable book about him, and saying that he was a guy who laid the scene for, I can't remember how she described it, but it was also sort of a mind-changing thing. The New Age. So Corinne Mouton wrote a whole book about Rampa. I later tried to actually get closer to Rampa's people myself. I tried to make contact with people who actually knew him. And much later, I became a total skeptic about Lobsang Rampa. My view of Lobsang Rampa became that Lobsang Rampa was an Englishman, a guy who lived in Britain, and he had read widely, and he started creating this persona as this lama whose spirit had gone into the body of an Englishman. So in actual fact, I concluded that Rampa was a total con man, but he was a very good con man, and he was excellent at it. And how he caught me and became my reference work was that his writings were so consistent that if you read his different books, he wouldn't contradict himself. And he would make statements that seemed to be almost true. And you would be hard pushed to disprove him on some things. But he knew how to push his story to a certain limit. And when I looked at his stuff logically, to me, I couldn't find anything where I could point out that he'd made a provable error. So when he makes an error, it's on something that you can't test. And much later, I began to realize that you get a lot of people who do spiritual stuff, whom I nowadays regard as total con men. And I can even cite some examples of them. There was a man in Oregon who wrote a book called Conversations with God. Now that guy is a 100% con artist, but they made a movie about him. He even gets invited to go and speak around the world. But if you look into his background, you'll see he actually had a marketing background, and he used to write advertising text. This guy knows how to market, and he invented a sort of spiritual concept, and it's very good for you. You start liking it. Everything he says, you will start liking it. But he's
that's
a total
the marketing.
fraud.
That's the marketing. Yeah, that's Neil Donald Walsh is the guy. He's it's like a self-help sort of Tony Robbins sort of a kind of thing. It's definitely a marketing ploy. He did it to make a lot of money. But how did Rampa get you into the Hollow Earth though? Like that's what I'm really interested in.
Okay, Rampa then began talking about things underground, and Rampa then specifically wrote about the Hollow Earth. He started saying that we who can astral travel, we can go into the Hollow Earth, we can go across the universe, and we can see things, and we're telling you what we're seeing. And so he spoke about the Hollow Earth as being a factual thing. Now, there are things that Rampa wrote about that I tried to hunt down. And I will tell you the most interesting story that I hunted for. I hunted for this for years, and I couldn't get to it. But I suspect that Lobsang Rampa read it in a book somewhere. But I've never been able to find anybody who can point me to the book. Let me tell you the story that he wrote that fascinated the living hell out of me. And this was one of the things I hunted for on Hollow Planets, that I wanted to try and see if it's true. You see, when I was doing Hollow Planets, I was trying to get to the Hollow Earth. I was I was a believer in World War III and the destruction of the Earth, especially North America, by nuclear missiles. That was a big thing for me because in my politics I was anti-communist and the Russians had lots of nuclear weapons. There was a prophecy side that was also driving me. So in the background, you must understand, I was looking at World War III. I was looking at thousands of nuclear missiles coming down on the USA, absolutely flattening the place. Communist armies rushing across Europe. And so the context of Hollow Planets was a survival thing, actually. And so when I wrote Hollow Planets, but I don't tell you this in the book. In the book, I stick very firmly to just the fact that I'm hunting for the hollow earth. But the reality is that I was hunting for an actual way to get inside the earth. I was hunting to find ways to get there and places to go, and I wanted physical stuff. So when I wrote Hollow Planets, I had all these prophecy and spiritual ideas behind me, but I wanted to get to the reality. I wanted to see, is this true? If it's true, where exactly is this? Where must I go? And can I go there? And if I can't go there, maybe I can tell other people so that they can go there. And in fact, after I launched Hollow Planets, there were guys who started talking about expeditions to the hollow earth. And there were guys trying to do expeditions up to, the last I heard was 2009, 2010. People trying to get to locations where we believed you could start getting into the hollow earth. So the hollow earth was a serious look at science and physics and geography. I wanted to find real things. And I wanted to find real things so that either I could go there or other people could go there. So you must understand that as wonky as I was, I wanted hard facts that I could put on the table, and I could say to you, listen, if you get in an aircraft and you leave, let's say somewhere in Canada, and you fly in that direction, that within 3 hours or 5 hours you will get to that and you'll start entering the hollow earth. That is exactly what I was trying to do with Hollow Planets. So returning to Lobsang Rampa gave various examples of things that he said related to the hollow earth. And one of the things he goes on and he gives sort of physical examples. Then I went and started digging into those things. Like one of the stories he spoke about was there were 2 American nuclear submarines. The one was called Scorpion and the one was called Thresher. Now those 2 nuclear submarines disappeared. Is everybody still there? Because
yeah,
I think somebody disappeared.
Oh yeah.
Oh no, we're here.
Yeah, I'm just listening.
Oh, Whalen
Okay.
dropped out of the call. Okay. It's okay.
Okay, so there were 2 American submarines, Scorpion and Thresher. Both of them disappeared, and they were destroyed with all hands on deck. And in one of Rampa's books, he says that he knows the secret of Scorpion and Thresher, and that the secret is really strange. But he won't tell us what it is. So I wondered, among many things, because you must also understand that part of the hollow earth is the issue of who's inside the hollow earth. And some of what came out of it is that some people, and I can't remember if Rampa specifically suggested this, I think he alluded to this, is that some of the UFOs that are seen come out from the hollow earth. So there are these advanced humans that live inside the hollow earth. Their flying saucers come out through the polar holes. because another big part of it was these holes that supposedly exist around the Arctic and Antarctic. So there are these enormous cavities, and you can literally just fly or sail straight into the hollow earth. You just go over the edge. Gravity will hold you, will hold you in the water or in the air, and you will just go around the edge, and you'll be able to sail or fly straight into this enormous cavern inside the earth. And that UFOs also come out from there. But there's also the thing of UFOs underwater. And I recall coming across many books that spoke about undersea UFOs. I've actually kept most of my old wonky literature because I found it so interesting at the time. And some fascinating things came out even from Brazil and so forth. A lot of weird UFO stuff came from Brazil, and some of it was pretty good, I must tell you. So I wondered whether Scorpion and Thresher had run into some kind of alien craft and the aliens destroyed it. But that was just what I wondered. Then the thing that I hunted for a specific story that Lobsang Rampa told. I hunted high and low for this. And for those of you who are in Britain, this thing seems to go back somewhere to Britain. What Lobsang Rampa spoke about was apparently a physical incident where people from underground, from inside the earth, ran into people from the surface of the earth. Now, he talks about a place. He says that there's this island, and the island is called Ultima Thule. And he says this island exists up in the north of Britain. He says if you go north of Britain and you carry on in the sea, it becomes very misty and very foggy. And there's this island called Ultima Thule. And Ultima Thule has a volcano on it. Ah, yes, while I'm on the topic of entrances to the hollow earth, just remind me to tell you about the volcano in California. Mount Shasta, because Rampa brought up Mount Shasta as well. Okay, returning to Ultima Thule. So Lobsang Rampa says that what happened was the British Navy sent an expedition.
Hey, hold on, I think Johnny dropped out.
Okay, you can begin.
Okay, so the sources that Lobsang is working with, when you hear about Ultima Thule and all that, I mean, that goes back to Pythias of Massila, which is now Marseille in France, who's a Greek guy who is a pretty good illustration of when we're talking about wonks, right? Like, or wonky guys. Like, he took a trip from Massila all the way to what he called Ultima Thule, which since has been kind of pinned down, and people think he went past the Phoenician tin mines over there in Western Britain, and he went all the way to Iceland, maybe Greenland. But he went all the way up there. That comes in later because Jules Verne, when he writes Voyage to the Center of the Earth, that entrance is in the volcano of Snæfellsjökull in Iceland. But the idea that Tibetans had some sort of connection to the hollow earth, as far as I can tell, goes back a lot further in the West, at least, to a guy named Yves d'Alvedre, or Saint-Yves d'Alvedre. He was a Frenchman who was initiated by, he claimed, well, of course these are all just claims, he claims he was initiated by an Indian man, and he was taught a language that predated Sanskrit, and that he learned all sorts of esoteric things in that way. And he also recounted astral travel to the inner earth through an entrance in Tibet in his book Mission à l'Inde, Mission to India. And that book was later translated into English. It's available as Journey to the Inner Earth, I believe, or Voyage to the Center of the Hollow Earth, something like that. But Dalvedra was pretty influential, and those ideas started filtering through the French esoteric world, which was kind of the hub of all of the esoteric ideas of the 19th century. And later, René Guénon, the traditionalist, he wrote a whole book about these claims called The King of the World. And he goes through Dalvedra and his claims, and he also brings in a book that at the time that Guénon was writing was really recent and was truly a phenomenon. And that was Beasts, Men, and Gods by Ferdynand Ossendowski, who was a Polish doctor who he was escaping from the Russian Revolution. The Reds surrounded his house, and he had to escape. And his only method of escape was to go through Mongolia and China. While in Mongolia, he fell in with Baron Roman von Ungen-Sternberg, who was a crazy Russian nobleman of German descent, Baltic nobleman, and he he had all sorts of weird beliefs, among which was he was the reincarnation of Genghis Khan and all that. But the parts that are pertinent to our story are that Ossendowski recounted a journey through the desert where the camels and all the animals grew very silent. And the people he was with were all Mongolians. Mongolians follow a form of Lamaism. You know, they recognize the Dalai Lama, all that. They had their own Lama, I believe, called the Bogd Khan, but they're basically from the same tradition. All these Mongolians that he was with started talking about the King of the Earth, who apparently dwelled far below the surface. And they had some really interesting claims that they made to Ossendowski that he later recounted. One of which was that the King of the Earth did occasionally visit the Earth, and he visited a monastery and gave the monastery a very interesting artifact. It was described as a large black stone with electric writing on it, like fluid electric writing, which is interesting for us if we're looking at parallels in the West, because that's exactly how one of the early Grail sources, Wolfram von Eschenbach, in his Parsifal, describes the Grail, the original Grail, before it was described as a chalice, a giant black rock with sort of liquid writing on it. And I believe there's some Islamic sources to that effect as well. But he said that after the Grail passed out of Europe, it went to the east, to the kingdom of Prester John, which a lot of people since have associated with the Nestorian Christians of Mongolia, precisely. So it's all very, very related. Now, these monks said that the King of the World gave them that stone, but then came back and he took it away, and he gave them in its place a large, I believe, a swastika seal or something like that, and a ring, which were still preserved at the monastery in Ossendowski's time. People at the time claimed, and Guénon was among them, that Ossendowski had just taken the whole thing from Sauni's Dalvedra, including the story of Agartha and all that. But actually, his spellings were very different, and there were certain elements of Ossendowski's story that are definitely not found in Sauni's Dalvedra, and it's unlikely that Ossendowski was reading Mission to India or any one of Alvejo's books. Later, in Europe, this kind of became a minor, cult theme. People were getting really into it, and a German man by the name of Theodor Illian ended up going to Tibet to check it out. He claimed that he had found the origin of these inner Earth mysteries, and in a city that was built partially underground with a very, very deep hole in it that if you threw a rock down, you'd never hear the rock. And he kept throwing giant rocks down the hole to hear if a sound reverberated, and no sound ever did. And he later had to get the hell out of Dodge, because it turned out that the monks, who were not following any form of Tibetan Buddhism in this particular town that he found were practicing a sort of cannibalistic cult. Very, very strange story that Ilian recounts there. Ilian later just kind of totally falls off the map. You can't find anything about him after he published his 2 books, In Secret Tibet and The Darkness Over Tibet.
Bingo. Now, those books, I've got one of them, and we can talk about that just now, but you carry on.
Yeah, so you see that those are probably what Lobsang Rampa was familiar with, and he was probably familiar with Saniv's Dalvedra too, because that's where we first get the idea of an astral journey into the inner earth. But yeah, as far as I can tell, those are his sources for his thinking, and then you could get a little bit in, I guess, make a theosophical justification. Obviously, Madame Blavatsky thought that. There was an ancient center at the North Pole, Thule, Hyperborea, all that. I'm sure the audience is very, very familiar, so we don't really need to talk about it. But I don't know what else to say. I think I've covered everything.
You mentioned the black stone with the writing on it.
Yeah.
And the first thing that reminded me of was 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it makes me wonder if the guy who wrote that was familiar or somehow like indirectly came into contact with that
Stanley
idea.
Kubrick was almost certainly, when you say the guy who wrote that, you got to understand that Arthur C. Clarke was hired to make a novelization of the movie so that people could watch it and understand. But it was Kubrick's film all the way, and certainly his last film, Eyes Wide Shut, demonstrates a real familiarity with the esoteric underground in its more deviant aspects. So it would not surprise me at all that Kubrick was at least tangentially familiar with this sort of legend.
Okay, interesting. Let me carry on with what Rampa wrote that I tried to prove but couldn't prove.
Please do.
So Rampa wrote about this island that is directly north of Britain. It's deep in the sea and it's surrounded by mist. And he says that the Royal Navy sent an expedition of ships to this island. And that when these sailors got there and they were walking around this island, and he also tells you that the main feature of this island is an enormous volcano. And he says that this volcano leads deep underground to the inner world. And he then says that these sailors these Royal Navy sailors were now exploring this island. And while they were exploring this island, they suddenly found themselves running into strange people who were on what I would call a hovering motorcycle, a sort of a hover cycle. And these people on these hover cycles were sort of running into these Royal Navy sailors. And Rampa says that in these sort of this accidental running into each other, nobody gets killed or anything, but it kind of frightens the British Navy. And he says that everything that happened on that island was documented by the Royal Navy and that there were sworn statements about it. And I was fascinated by this because now I had a real location to go hunting for. And I had documentation of a sort to try and hunt for. I even sent many letters to, I think, to the Royal Navy itself. I sent them to Britain. I found like the museum or the archives or whatever, and I tried to send them emails without explaining Lobsang Rampa, saying, I'm looking for details of an expedition that you sent to an island north of Britain called Ultima Thule. But then I went and dug on maps. And one of the things I did with Hollow Planets, I accumulated maps of all parts of the world like you cannot believe. I have the most detailed maps of the Arctic and Antarctic, enormous maps that cost me a lot of money, that I got, because I hunted for every single detail I could. And anyway, in this regard, I finally came to a conclusion that I found the right island. And the island I found, I'll have to hunt around to try and get you the name. But I'll describe to you where it is, because you can find it on a map. You just have to go and look in as much detail, and you will find it on a map. It exists. And it's not called Ultima Thule. It's got another name. And I think almost the name begins with S or something like that. But if you look in the sea, very directly north of Britain, almost if you take Scotland and you go further north,
I think you're talking about Jan Mayen. Or Jan Mayen.
That sounds
it's
like
a small volcanic island directly north of Iceland, and between Norway and
Iceland. Can you just type the name so that I can quickly Google it?
Sure.
You know what? That sounds like exactly it. Let me just quickly go and check it up on the internet. Because I looked and...
Well, that's exactly, it fits the exact description. It's a volcanic island, very small, directly north of Britain. I would not be surprised that expedition had occurred, because in the late 19th century, there was a British move to annex Iceland. And it started off a whole craze with the publication of sagas and the translation of that literature. L.A. Waddell, who is a guy who was a Tibetanist, actually, really interested in Tibet, but he also published a book claiming the Eddas had their origin in Britain and their original origin in Phoenicia, making, I believe, to be some kind of runic argument. But yeah, the point is that the British at the time were very interested in the area of Iceland, the area north of it, and I'm sure that the Royal Navy made some journeys thereabouts. In Elizabeth's time, John Dee, the wizard, basically he was a wizard, he tried to convince Queen Elizabeth to purchase Greenland, thinking that was the location of Ultima Thule. So people have been interested in this for a very long time, hundreds and hundreds of years.
Right, I've had a look at it. That's definitely the island, Jan Mayen Island. And the volcano there is Beerenberg. So judging by Lobsang Rampa's descriptions, I concluded this is the exact thing he's talking about. So I wrote to people and I asked about this Jan Mayen Island and had any expeditions taken place to it. And the answer from the archivists of the Royal Navy, they said no, nothing had ever happened. But what I suspected, this is what I believe, is that when Lobsang Rampa says that there were people who wrote, they actually wrote testimonies to that effect, I figured that either somebody had written a book about it, or maybe it was published in some newspaper or magazine, and that somewhere, if we dig enough, somewhere we will find the story of this strange encounter on this island between the Royal Navy.
The book is The Dusky God, I think, that he took it from. The other guys on the podcast, I think, read that in prep for the show, but the location of the maelstrom described by the author is pretty near to Jan Mayen.
Yeah, the smoky god.
If anyone can get to that particular story, I would like to see where it's published, because the way he describes it, it sounds like he's copied it from somewhere.
Southern California.
Yeah, that's Mount Shasta. But I'm fascinated by that story. I'd like to just know who wrote it and in what book that story comes from, because I don't think Rampa made it up. I think he was copying it from somewhere. But he was very careful not to give his source for that book. And that was
there's a very, very similar story, before I forget, that is in kind of an aside in Sarah Orne Jewett, who's an American author. She's pretty popular now because, she's an early women's author. She only talked about women, the feminist lover. But in her short story, The Country of the Pointed Furs, a naval journey to Ultima Thule is described with shadowy people. I believe they're described as shadowy people, not quite fully formed humans, kind of walking around over there. So, pretty bizarre. But yeah, all of these things are clearly sources for Rampa's imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, the Smoky God I've got, and the Smoky God doesn't have that story in it. I
No.
can't remember what the Smoky God's got. It's a long time since I read it.
I'll look into that, and I'll have it for the next part that we do, so when we do part 2 of this.
Okay. Well,
we have
if you guys can find.
So we'll have things to tie into past episodes and future episodes. So I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jan.
Okay, so that was one thing I wanted to try and prove for Hollow Planets, but I couldn't get the source, so I never put it in Hollow Planets. I hunted for lots and lots of stories, and there were sort of fringe things that I dug into and made some sort of headway, but I regarded it as not solid enough to put in on Hollow Planets. So then these are the kinds of things that didn't make it to Hollow Planets. Lobsang, and of course in Hollow Planets, I never mentioned Lobsang Rampa, never, because my quest is to try and produce something physical and provable, something that we can, put a hand on, Lobsang Rampa also said that there are people saying that Mount Shasta is also a place where you can enter into the hollow earth. But Lobsang Rampa specifically said that the people who claim that Mount Shasta is an entrance to the hollow earth is that they are lying and they're just doing it to make money. And interestingly enough, when I went to the USA in 2010, I actually drove past Mount Shasta, and it's very imposing, I must tell you. But yeah, Lobsang Rampa reckoned that was rubbish. But of course, he was peddling his own rubbish, and he was very careful how he did it.
Exactly.
And
it's funny how that always works.
And Lobsang Rampa did later go to Canada and lived in Canada. So I tried to actually get to the people who were on his will. I even tried to get to people linked to him. I even had some sort of email addresses, but I tried to get to somebody who knew him personally. And I found, because he was kind of weird, he lived with a woman that he said wasn't his wife, and her daughter also lived with him. And that daughter, I managed to almost get some connection there. But yeah, I wanted to also get to the bottom of Lobsang Rampa to see if in his stuff I could get other detail. But when I did Hollow Planets, I didn't dig further into Lobsang Rampa. And most of Lobsang Rampa's really important prophecies, because he also claimed he knew the future, because the people from other dimensions have got advanced computers and they can calculate the future with a certain amount of probability. And he basically got me into thinking that by 1999 to the year 2000, the turn of the millennium, that would be when World War III comes about, massive world war, and America would be defeated, and that all hell would break loose. And when these things didn't happen, that was the beginning of my sort of red pilling away from those kinds of things. That started switching me off, and I focused more on just science and history and politics. Those are the things that I then began focusing on.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned 2000 as a turning point, because in your book, I'm going to quote a little passage here. In
Go for it.
1983, K.A. Whaler wrote, "It now seems that around 1969, a spectacular change took place in the geomagnetic field. The change was almost synchronous over the whole of the Earth's surface, took place in less than 2 years, and is now known to have consisted of a jerk, a steep change in its secular acceleration of the..." Darn it. "Of the magnetic field that has its origin inside the Earth." Now, I don't know if you were aware of this, but it was at that exact time that we entered, say the esoterists, the age of Aquarius during the precession of the equinoxes. So, while 2000 is not a significant astronomical or astrological event, 1968, 1969 definitely were. And the fact that those geomagnetic changes happened on the Earth at that time is pretty fascinating.
Interesting. Later, now that you mention entering the age of Aquarius, what I'm about to tell you comes from my history reviewed. I was digging into various religious stuff and religious mythology. And in there, they were talking about ages as well. But there they are saying that the age of Aquarius begins in about 2150 or 2158. Because I know that people said we'd entered the age of Aquarius, but my current understanding is that that's not true, that by astronomy, we only enter the age of Aquarius in about 150 years from now. So maybe it's just something worth checking up on.
Well, there's a reason it's so controversial. It's because you've got two big questions. One is, are we judging it from the entering into the constellation or the midpoint of the constellation?
Okay.
Or then you have the problem that with Ptolemaic astrology, the constellations are actually in kind of a different place, but compared to where they are now. But the general consensus among the more educated people that are into this is that, yeah, the age of Aquarius really did begin in 1968, 69.
Right. Okay, you've clarified a bunch of things. But yeah, so Lobsang Rampa was the guy. There were some other things in one of his books. I'm trying to think. I collected every single book that Lobsang Rampa wrote, every single one. In fact, I was so determined to get his stuff that I even had 2 and 3 copies of every single book he ever wrote. And I have some old ones.
Even the biography his cat wrote?
Yes. Yes, I have them all, every last one. And you know what's another one that he wrote that many people didn't really pick up on is he wrote a strange little book which was called My Visit to Venus. Did you ever come across that?
I always assumed that was a spurious one. I didn't think that he actually wrote that one, but...
Okay. The more I dug into that, in one of his books, he does say he did write it. He says something like, almost like it was a test or something. And I went and got My Visit to Venus, and I read it. And that thing is interesting because it's not Lobsang Rampa as we got to know him later. This is just an earlier thing that he tried to do. And I was quite convinced that he did write it. That was my conclusion. And I looked at it and it was very fascinating. And I'll tell you where this visit to Venus might come in, is that in the early days of ufology, people were talking about meeting aliens, and all the aliens they were running into were aliens from other planets in the solar system. And I found that exceptionally fascinating. Among my UFO stuff that I dug into, there was a guy in Brazil, a guy called Dino Kraspedon. and he wrote a book about UFOs. There are a couple of UFO books that I gathered over the years that I really liked. I really liked them in the sense that they weren't things that you could easily disprove. When you studied them, they were quite solid in their logic. And this book by Dino Kraspedon included mathematics. And when I did Hollow Planets, a guy that I give credits to people that I spoke to when I did Hollow Planets. I give acknowledgements. And one of the people I mentioned here in the beginning is a guy called Dr. Lou Gordeev from the University of Tübingen, Germany. And the guy who wrote the foreword to my book is a guy called Dr. Mitchell Gonnett from the University of Witwatersrand here in Johannesburg. And Gonnett, I believe, still lives here in South Africa. He's actually an American Mormon. And the Mormons have a great interest in the Hollow Earth. The Mormons, because in the Book of Mormon, there's something that makes them believe in the Hollow Earth. But my most reliable, shall I call it, scientific guy was this Dr. Lou Gordeev, who I think was a Russian. And he was in Germany. And I had him do many calculations for me when I wrote Hollow Planets. And he did calculations on some of the photographs. And that is how we were able to figure out where certain things are. Because I had photographs of what seemed to be the polar hole, the hole that is the entrance into the inner earth. And I had him look into that. And then later, I gave him the stuff from Dino Kraspedon, which I never published. You see, in the things I was doing, I was digging into so many things. There's stacks of stuff I dug into that I never published because I could never say that this stuff proves anything. But it was interesting when I gave him the mathematics that came from that UFO book from South America, where he actually studied the mathematics and he said he couldn't find anything wrong with it. He said, this is really advanced stuff. And coming back to my visit to Venus, you had guys like Adamski who said that he met people from Venus. And there was even a woman in South Africa, and apparently she even lived close to where I live now in Johannesburg, Elizabeth Clara. And Elizabeth Clara claimed to have met Venusians. She claimed to have had a child with a Venusian, okay? And I think at some point, I was telling people the other day, I think I maybe even met her at one point. I remember digging a lot into Elizabeth Clara's stuff as well, but I never published any of this. And the point I'm getting to is that there was a time in the early days of UFOs where everybody was writing about aliens coming from other planets. And this one from Dino Kraspedon. Dino Kraspedon says that every single planet in the solar system is inhabited. And I thought to myself, how can every planet be inhabited? Because I know my astronomy and it can't be. But in the back of my mind, I was asking the question, what if the planets are hollow? If they are hollow, then maybe all of them could be inhabited. And that was something that kind of half sat in the back of my head. But I later concluded, my ultimate conclusion about those early UFOs and these Venusians, especially the people from Venus, because Venus is so close to the Earth, it's almost the same size, and it's totally shrouded in cloud. You can't see what's on the surface. Was that this stuff could also have included CIA games that they were playing. And the particular guy that I eventually focused on, that this guy was an actual CIA operative, was a guy called Howard Menger. And I was actually looking at Howard Menger's book earlier today. Howard Menger claimed to have had contact with aliens, and he talks a lot about physical stuff. And he also talks about nutrition and food. All of them come up with some kind of information that they got from these aliens. And Howard Menger later stopped doing UFO stuff, and people were still very interested in him. And at one point, people were saying to Howard, please tell us about UFOs. And Howard Menger said to them, there's really nothing to tell, because it was actually part of a CIA thing I was doing. But the people were so interested in UFOs that they didn't want to believe him when he said that he'd done stuff as a result of a CIA psychological project. And so he went back and he started lecturing about UFOs again. And there are many things, when I look at the early photographs from the books, it's to me as if there was a time when I think the CIA was sort of doing some psychology tests on people. I really believe this, even though I've never come across documentation to prove any of what I'm about to tell you. I believe that at various points, governments, the military, the CIA, have actually conducted experiments on normal people. And it's not an experiment that they tied you down or anything. They float a story. And they observe. They have psychologists who observe the response of people to that story. And I'll tell you why I think they do it. I think they do it because in the early days of UFOs, the feeling was that these aliens are good people. We have made contact with a strong civilization of good people, and these people can come and free us from our tyrannical governments. And there's this belief that if the aliens would land, they will solve all our problems. And so from a military government perspective, the question is, if aliens were to really come to the earth, would our people suddenly flock to them and hand over their allegiance to them? Would we lose control of our populations, and what would we do? So that is why I think some of these things were done. It's purely my theory, my thinking. I believe, and I believe this on many levels, that there are times when the CIA conducts psychological experiments, and they go and they test people to get a psychological profile of people. But it's not because they are interested in UFOs or they believe in UFOs. Their concern is about the behavior of normal human beings when they believe something, and this thing might in some way unsettle the status quo. And they would just want hard facts on it. That's all.
That's 100% correct. That's the basis of the MK Ultra mind control program from the CIA that started off in the 60s, maybe even earlier. But that was the A/B testing that Adamski was working on. It's basically, like you said, it's not whether. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Was Adamski in on that?
That is literally. According to Whalen, Whalen had to take off. Whalen said that is literally the point of his work, was the A/B testing of the MK Ultra stuff. So, I mean, it makes sense, because whether or not the CIA, knows or believes in aliens or any of that, they do use this kind of programming to control people. I mean, like you said, I've talked about this with Horace on many occasions about the programming, these aliens programming series that they've been pushing onto people through the media, the Ancient Aliens shows and the alien memes, like you were saying, people believe that if these aliens land and they're going to fix everything, they're going to come down and they're going to show us the meaning of life and the meaning of the universe, and everything's going to be all right, and they're going to show us how we can operate without these horrible tyrannical governments, and the magic aliens are going to come down and fix everything. And I don't know what movies they were. I can't remember. It's in all the movies. Anytime you see,
there was
an ID4, like in Independence Day, they had the people that were standing up on top of the buildings with the signs, please, aliens welcome, and like they're all excited. Yeah.
Yes,
and it's all. I believe that a lot of that is a government psyop of the CIA, and again, the CIA has been involved in stuff like that many, many times. The MK Ultra program being one of them, the Monarch mind control one being another one. So I mean, and that's the alien theory. But getting back to the aliens and the hollow planet part, though, you had mentioned in your book that what was it? There were the pictures of what were supposedly the holes in the poles, and you had somehow proved that those weren't holes in the poles.
Yes, that is correct. You see, back then, because I started my work on hollow planets, I started writing it in 1995 because in about 1994, 1995, I ran a mailing list, and there's a website. There's a website run by a thing called VJ Enterprises, and some of my old emails are published on there, and you'll see my actual emails. The email address that is there no longer exists. I actually shut it down the other day. That email address spread around so much that eventually it just became a place for spam. People sent me endless kinds of junk after 20 years. But I published all kinds of emails about things I was thinking at the time. And if you read some of those emails, you'll see that I was thinking about many of these UFO things. I was thinking about spiritual things. I was thinking about prophecies. And those emails are my emails that are there. But when I wrote Hollow Planets itself, I needed to do something that had some kind of physical proof. And I turfed out anything that I could not find physical proof for, or which I did look into and I can say that this is not so. All those kinds of things I put into Hollow Planets because I wanted Hollow Planets to be a real thing that you can trust. And you'll see that it's filled with references, scientific papers. So I went on a great mission hunting for data. And I wrote Hollow Planets basically from 1995 to 1999. In 1999, I was still putting in the finishing touches, including my stop press, which was about the scientist I found. And that scientist, I'm still in touch with him to this day, and he published a lot of interesting stuff. So there are other aspects of Hollow Planets that I regard as very important. But returning to the pictures of the actual polar hole, in Hollow Planets, I went to NASA. I spent a lot of money contacting NASA and hunting for pictures. And you will actually find that the photos I have in Hollow Planets, that many of them have got reference numbers. These are reference numbers of photographs that I actually bought. I bought them from NASA. Like I'm looking here at plate number 7. It says, Apollo 16 photograph. What is the strange circular feature at the top of the photograph? And I give the NASA catalog number. So, and then there's plate 8 and plate 9, plate 10, plate 11. All of these have got some kind of circular feature. And these are genuine NASA photographs, even plate 12. These are proper NASA photographs. I bought them from NASA. I had them and I scanned them and I looked closely at them. Now, in these photographs, you see a cloud-covered United States, and you see it leads down. You can see like the coast of California. And then when you look at this hole up in the north, then it looks like it's almost at the pole, or if it's not at the pole, it's slightly to the side of the North Pole. So when I was looking for this polar hole, the original idea from what's the scientist, I forget the scientist who came up with the idea that the Earth is hollow, but it was a British scientist, Sir Edmund Halley.
Edmund Halley. Yes, Edmund Halley there. Mr. Halley's Comet. Yes.
Yes. Now, he was the guy who actually came up with the idea of the hollow Earth. And in fact, he came up with the idea that there might be several Earths, one inside each other, like one shell inside each other. And if you look at his ideas, he was using the aurora as a means of explaining. He was using the hollow Earth as a means of explaining the aurora. Okay, and so that means that the entrance to the hollow Earth is in the north, by the North Pole, because that's where the aurora is, right? But when I was looking at hollow planets, I was saying to myself that many people are saying that the hole is centered on the actual Arctic and Antarctic, but maybe the hole is smaller and maybe it's sitting to the side. So maybe you can go to the North Pole, be at the North Pole, and there won't be a polar hole there. But maybe just a few hundred miles away from the North Pole is a hole, and it's a smaller hole, and you can get into the Earth there. So I called that the offset polar hole, okay? And when I looked at these photos, these things look to me like, man, if there's ever been photographs of the polar hole, this is it. And there are other photographs that other people used, like photos used by plate number 6 is NASA's ESSA-7 photograph taken in 1968. Now that shows a hole at the poles, and Dennis Crenshaw liked to use that stuff in his hollow Earth stuff. But I found these pictures, several of them from NASA, with this strange feature. And by the way, since I wrote Hollow Planets, there have been other NASA photographs from other planets that have got weird things. But I never got around to doing Hollow Planets 2. Anyway, when I looked at these things, I sent them to Dr. Gurdjieff, and I said to him, is there any way that we can actually determine the exact location of those features? Because in the cloud cover, as you go north, there's more and more cloud cover, and you can't see land. So you can see that this is somewhere slightly to the north, slightly northwest of the American coastline, but you can't see exactly where it is. And now, of course, the Earth being circular, you have to take the aspect of perspective into consideration. So Dr. Lou Gurdjieff did calculations for me, and he came back and he showed me exactly where the location is. And in plate 9, I draw the actual circle. And it turns out that strange feature is a feature that you see there where Asia and America almost join. And it seems to be a sort of a weather feature, but it's a big thing. And I was able to draw exactly where that hole is. And it's not a hole, it's a weather phenomenon. But on the NASA photographs, it looks very impressive. These were the best polar hole pictures that I came across ever. And they were clearly consistent in several NASA photographs.
But they were very convincing. They were very convincing that they could have been a hole, but in fact they were just the weather.
That's disappointing.
It is disappointing,
Yeah,
but I do like that theory that Sir Edmund Halley put forward, that the multiple Earths inside, like the Russian stacking dolls or whatever it is, the doll inside the doll inside the
Yes,
doll.
those Russian dolls.
Yep,
Yes.
and that's basically it, and that this was some sort of the inner atmosphere leaking out, which is the Aurora Borealis. Now we're coming up on, we're going to do this in a multi-part series. You think that's a good stopping point for today? You think?
Absolutely. We've done an hour and 20 minutes.
All
if
right.
we can wind up on this, then we can come back to this again.
Most certainly. This is amazing. I'm very glad to be doing this. This is one of my favorite subjects ever since I was a kid, because when I was a kid, there was a TV show called Land of the Lost. I don't know if you remember that at all. It's an American television show about a family that was exploring somewhere in the jungle, and they fell into a hole, and they fell and fell and fell down a waterfall and into a world that was basically prehistoric. There were dinosaurs, and there were it was a tropical jungle setting, and there were these alien type beings called the Sleestaks that were like the bad guys, and I was probably 5 or 6 or 7 when I first started watching this, and it really got me into the whole idea that there could be worlds inside of this planet. So for me, this is a very exciting. It's going to be a very exciting series. Waylon had to take off, and he's got some. He's got some stuff, and he had to leave, but he did. He sends his regards, and he says thank you, Jan. And yes, thank you for coming on. You guys want to add anything in closing before we take off today?
I would say, well, first of all, this is excellent, and I'm really looking forward to the next episode. But for any listeners who are skeptical, and it's understandable, this is information that you probably never heard, but anybody who's skeptical, I would really encourage you to go on YouTube and just look up Jan Lamprecht, The Hollow Earth, and you can find a video titled Jan Lamprecht Nexus Conference 2003. And I think that's a really good starting point for a skeptic who wants to know more, because Jan talks about how the Hollow Earth is as consistent with seismological information about the Earth, like earthquakes, like data they have about earthquakes and that sort of thing. The Hollow Earth is as consistent or more consistent with all that collected data than the Solid Earth series. And it's about an hour long. You can watch it. It's purely scientific, and it's a good way to sort of get into the mindset where you can start to shake off this, these false ideas you have about the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Something I would like to add. When I did Hollow Planets and I dug into the science, afterwards there were things that happened, and there are some things that people only told me about in recent years that I was astounded as what I would call one of the consequences of my book Hollow Planets. And the one thing that I will leave you with is this, that even though I could not prove the Earth is hollow, and even though I currently don't really believe it's hollow, what I do believe is that science is not fully accurate in everything. And when we talk about the seismology and other aspects of science, you will see that I am still a skeptic on certain things. And there are very important topics that still need to be looked at. And I was very glad to see, to my amazement, only a few months ago, somebody actually sent me a link where people were discussing hollow planets and seismology I did. And they were then talking about recent NASA discoveries and how some of that may tie back to some of what I was writing. So I may not have been dead accurate in everything, but I do think that I dug deep enough into many topics that there are things we can still dig into and lines of thinking that are still valid that you can go and dig into. Because I do not believe everything in science. I believe many things in science, but there are still things I question even now.
Yeah, this has made me question so many different things in science that I've learned growing up. I really appreciate your book. I mean, it's great. I'm reading it for a second time now. It takes me like sometimes 2 or 3 times to really digest something as well as I need to. Yeah, thanks for doing this. We'll be back in a couple weeks with another one, and we'll.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, hang on, Jan, for a bit. I got a couple questions for you after we get off. But everybody, tune in, and in a couple weeks we'll be doing another one of the Paranormies Presents Hollow Planets. We'll see you later.